Hey, welcome back to another TouchDesigner tutorial. So today I'm going to be showing you how to take some of the motion tracking that I've done in the previous tutorial, which I'm going to link to in the description, and I'm going to show you how to make some audio reactive visuals that you can also control with motion. You can also just use some other type of input if you'd like. So the main things that we're going to be covering today are kind of just making some different audio reactive visuals. And from this tutorial, there's actually going to be two main components that you're going to be able to take away from this. So the first one is actually a little custom component that I actually use for all of my audio reactive stuff. So this is a technique that I haven't really seen other people use for their audio reactivity, and I'm really excited to share it with you. The second is a custom component that lets you do some nice feedback loops and have some different controls to do things like reaction diffusion. And I use this for a lot of different visuals. So I think this part specifically gives us some nice kind of like fluid-like visuals. And here's a quick video showing some of the visuals that you'll be able to produce after the tutorial. All right, let's go ahead and dive into it. So instead of just deleting the entire project, because at the very end, we're gonna hook everything up to the motion capture, what I'm gonna do is just place down a brand new container. And this is actually a way that I like to kind of build my projects in general. And what I usually do for these containers is I like to set them up so that they can scale to the project resolution. So that way, if I am ever trying to display my projects on like a larger screen, or I put in a Pro TouchDesigner license, I can change the resolution in one place and it'll update the rest of my project. So it's a really simple process. There's one little Python command. We can just write parent dot width and parent parentheses dot height. And what that'll allow us to do is this container will now scale to match the resolution. If I go out to the project, it'll match the resolution of our project. And so now if I go into the layout here and I change the resolution, the inner container will also update. So there's two more small things that we need to change. And what I'm going to do is go to this panel section and turn display off. Normally containers are used to basically display UI. So what you'll notice is it doesn't kind of stick to the normal network flow. It'll just display itself on the parent container. So for example, if I put down like a button and I zoom out, you'll see that automatically the button displays on the parent container, and we don't necessarily want that. So you can go in, for example, and turn display off, and now it's not displayed automatically on the parent container. So the reason we're doing this is because we're going to actually output a specific top from this container, and then we want to be able to kind of control what gets displayed to our final perform mode. Okay, the last little thing here is that I just want to set this so that it previews and we get to see the background top or whatever is being output. So what I usually have to do is use /out1, and this will display whatever our output is. I'm going to rename this as kind of like our default container, and I reuse this all the time. Like I basically use this for all of my different containers when I'm building a project. So let's save this. I'm going to open up the palette, and if you go to my components, if you don't have a folder here already, you can right click and you can hit add folder, and then you can name it whatever you want. But let's go ahead and just take this default container and we're going to drag and drop it into custom, and we're going to reuse it for later. And now what you can do is you can take that default container, you can see I've already made it, and you can drop it, and now you have all of those parameters set up by default. So let's go ahead and go inside the default container. We're basically going to build out the initial set of visuals with the noise to kind of get that fabric-like look. So from here, let's go ahead and start by creating a noise. And this is where the resolution part comes into play. So the first thing I do when I have a starting node is I actually go to the common page and I set the input to use parent panel size, and notice it automatically scaled to the resolution of this container. So basically we're using kind of this hierarchy so that we can just change the resolution in one place. So next thing I'm going to do is just kind of create a output for ourselves. I'm going to go ahead and right click here and make an out, And this we're gonna put at like a very, very far section of our network. So we're gonna go all the way out to the right, and then if you want, you can always like turn the background on for it. The main thing that I was playing around with for this is kind of like linking two different noise components together to procedurally generate some motion. And these were some values that I landed on for the noise component that I felt looked good. So I'm gonna zoom this first noise period to about 10. This will kind of control the general scaling of it. We're just gonna turn monochrome off. So I kind of wanted to be like zoomed in on this first noise. The other thing we can do is we can place another noise, and you can actually use this first one to modify the color, and then the second input is gonna modify a displacement. So this will give us some nice kind of like ripply effects. And one thing to note here is that you'll notice that it's a little bit too washed out. So I'm gonna take this offset and I'm gonna bring it down. And then from here, I'm gonna zoom in a bit more. So I'm gonna go up to like 20. I'm gonna bring the harmonic spread up a little bit to maybe like 3.8. So the other thing you can do too is we can kind of displace it again by itself. And what that'll allow us to do is kind of get this like marbly effect. And I'm gonna tone the displace weight down a fair amount. So we're basically kind of shifting the pixels around based off of the color value here. I'm gonna shift it by like 0.1, 0.1, so we get kind of a smaller effect. I'm gonna make sure that this is actually connected to our output. And basically the last little piece here is to use an edge, which is gonna basically search for highlights. And then we're gonna bump up the strength of this a ton to like 200. Oh, and let's bump it up to like 100. And I'm gonna change the sample step as well to about 5, the main edges of this. I do feel like it looks a little grainy. So I think what I'm gonna do here as well is insert a blur to kind of smooth it out a little bit. And other than that, I think the last thing that I did here was basically to just add in an RGB delay. And what that allows us to do is it kind of like pulls apart the color channels. So if you go into the palette up here and you go into image filters and you look for RGB delay, we'll place that in. And now when there's motion, what it'll do is it'll basically pull apart those red, green, and blue channels. I think that by default, the RGB delay is a little bit too intense, so we're gonna kind of tone it down. So I think maybe around like -6, -4, -2. And let's go ahead and add some motion to this. So what we can do here is this noise here in the transform, I'm gonna add in ABS time.seconds, and we get way too much motion. So I'm gonna multiply it by like 0.05. And now we can kind of see some of the visuals that it's creating. I might bump up the blur a little bit more because the edges of this are looking a little interesting. Oh, okay, one other major thing to remember to do for this is that we want to make sure to take this noise component and set our input to 32-bit float. Notice that a lot of those artifacts start to go away. So now we can get these like this kind of smooth cloth-like motion. So the next thing that I want to do is instead of driving this noise with time, I want to actually drive this with audio reactivity. So let's go ahead and start by building out that component. Because this component doesn't have any visuals, we can actually just build it inside of a base. So I'm going to put a base and I'm going to call this our audio reactivity. And let's go ahead and put a audio file in. We want to be able to connect it to this container, right? So I'm going to go inside, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to place an in chop. And now if I zoom out, we have an opening point for it. So I'm going to go ahead and connect that audio device in. And then what we want to do here, one thing that I found really useful just as a starting point for audio reactivity is to actually just use the component from the palette. So if you go to tools, there's a component called audio analysis. Now, if you drop this down, you can connect the audio analysis to our audio input. Notice by default, the low is active, but we want to activate the mids and the highs. And that will basically do some audio analysis for us. The other part too is I want to change the gain of these so that the gain of the low is at 1, that the mids are at 1, and the highs are at 1. And you might want to turn down the smoothing. You can always tweak these parameters afterwards as well. But basically what we can do now is place a null, and we can see we're getting the analysis for the lows, mids, and highs. Just for helpfulness, I generally like turning on as well the like kick, snare, and rhythm activation, and notice that those channels start activating. The next thing that we want to do is to select out our lows, mids, and highs. So we'll place a select chop. And then we're going to grab those specific channels. So I can type in low, space, mid, space, high, and now we have those specific channels. And what we want to do with these is, and this is like kind of the unique part here, we want to take the slope of the lows, the mids, and the highs, and make sure to turn on this slope per sample. And basically what this is going to do is it is going to look at the change in the values for your lows and mids and highs. And I think that this gives you some really, really like dynamic movement in your visuals. I feel like what'll happen is using the slope gives you a lot more detail depending on what sound is happening. I feel like a lot of times I've done things in the past where I just map the kick or I just map the snare. And I think using the lows, mids, and highs and getting the slope of them actually gives you way more detail or way more like movement based off of the song. So I'm going to do two things here. I want to have only the positive values because usually it's more helpful to have the values not go negative. And what we can do here is we can add in a limit. And there's a little flag here, so we can turn positive only. And then the last thing that I want to do here as well is I'm going to make another channel that basically just adds all the lows, mids, and highs together. And we're going to kind of merge that back in so that we have lows, mids, and highs and all of them combined. So I'm going to put down a math chop, and we can combine these channels by adding them. And let's go ahead and rename this. So I'm going to rename this to slope underscore all. And what I'm going to do as well is I'm going to make another rename, and I want to rename this as like slope underscore low, slope underscore mid, high. And we can do that by saying slope underscore star. And that will basically take the original name and tack in this at the beginning. So slope low, mid, high. And let's merge them together. Okay, so now we have values that they're going to kind of like oscillate back and forth. Like that can be really helpful for certain visuals that we want to have oscillate back and forth. But usually when you're doing audio reactive visuals, you might also want a value that continuously counts up. For example, in a place where we would put in ABS time.seconds. So here what I'm going to do, I'm going to put down a speed chop, which basically continuously adds up on the previous values. And I'm going to actually rename this as well. And I'm going to call this count underscore star. So we know that it's like counting up essentially. And then the last thing that I want to do is I kind of want to merge all of these options back in with our original channels so that we have all of these different outputs available to use. So I'm going to take a merge chop and I'm going to connect the rename. So we have all of the values that are continuously counting up. Then I also want to take the values just before this speed, and I'm going to connect that to the merge. So I have the values that are going to oscillate back and forth. But then I think it's also helpful to get the original input from the audio analysis. So we're going to drag that all the way over. So that way we get things like the original lows, mids, and highs, and like the kick and snare detection. And if we make an output, now we'll see that we have that available on our output. One last little thing that I generally like to do is I really like having easing on these different values because sometimes they can be pretty choppy at first. So what I like to do here is I'll normally insert a lag at the very, very end. And I like to put this as a value available on the container that we can change. So basically the lag will do linear interpolation, so I'll add easing to it. The first parameter here tells us how much easing there should be when values are increasing. The second parameter tells us how much easing there should be when the value is decreasing. What we can do here is let's go ahead and you can either right click on this little audio reactivity container here and click on customize component. Another way to reach that is if you view your container, you can right click on it here and hit customize component. And we can create a little custom settings page. And if we hit add page, it's available here. Now that page is available, we can actually just go inside our component. And this part is really nice. We can just take this lag. I'm going to click on the text for lag here. Notice that when I click and drag, it starts to turn into an arrow. And now I can drag it over to this parameter page, drop it, and I'm going to hit bind as new parameter master. Now that it's there, you'll see when I zoom out, we have that in our settings page available. And what's great is that if we change the value inside the component, it'll reflect on the outside. And if we change it on the outside, it'll reflect on the inside. So the last piece here is I also really like setting the speed reset, because sometimes I want those values to go back to 0. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the reset value here, and I'm going to take this pulse, reset pulse, and I'm going to drag this over to the component parameter page. We can go ahead and close this. I'm going to go up a layer, and now we can actually set up our audio reactivity. Let's go ahead and put a null down. And what I want to use for this is our count slope all. The way we're going to do this is I'm going to go ahead and click on the noise here and go over to the transform. Oops, click on this noise over here and go to the transform where I was normally putting in time. And instead, I'm going to go ahead and put the null into an active view. And then I'm going to take this count slope all, and I'm going to drag and drop that in as a reference. And it's going to go super, super fast. So let's like change it to be by like 0.3. There we go. And let's hear this. So if I put down a audio device out and then hook this up, cool. So I've found this to be really, really responsive. I've been a huge fan of using this slope technique to be able to make my visuals audio reactive. I think it goes a long, long way. And also try playing around with mapping the lows, the mids, and the highs to different parameters depending on what parts of your visuals that you want to drive with your audio. The other thing that I want to do really quickly is let's save this audio reactivity component and have it available for later. So if you go back into your palette, maybe make a folder called audio, and what you can do is, or just put it in any custom folder, you can take this component now and you can just drag and drop this into your palette, and then we have it available to use whenever. I use it very, very often. Okay, so the next part that we want to do is to kind of make that rippley feedback effect. If you're new to feedback loops, there are a couple of tutorials that I'm going to link to in the description. What we're going to do is basically build out a little reusable container that we can use to create some of these feedback loops. So I'm going to go ahead and drop down my default container because we're going to build another reusable component. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make an input and I'm going to connect it to an output. And then we can zoom out and I will put this displace as our input, and then on the output, I'm going to connect it to our edge over here. So now you'll see we've got the whole network flowing through it. All right, we're going to go ahead and build our feedback network. So I'm going to start by putting the null down. We're going to make our classic feedback top. I'm going to put in a level so that we can control the opacity. And we're going to put down a composite, set it to over. And we're going to connect our original input to the composite, and then we're going to drag the composite onto the feedback network. And what we want to do here is if we go into our post and we tone the opacity down a little bit, you can see we can kind of get these like soft trails now. This is kind of the classic feedback network. And basically what's happening here, the way I like to think about it is that this top layer right here of the feedback network, this is like our previous frame. And this lower part of the network right down here is our current frame. So we're basically taking our previous frame and we're layering it on top of our incoming frame. And that allows us to kind of blend them together, right? So if we turn the opacity all the way up, we have a freeze frame of our previous frame and it's fully layered on top, but if we add a little bit of opacity, it's kind of fading out over time. Okay, so one really, really important thing to make this effect work is to turn on clamp here in this level so that it goes from 0 to 1. I actually spent a lot of time finessing this earlier to try to figure out why it wasn't working. That was the trick. So basically for this network, we're going to kind of make a reaction diffusion type effect. We're going to kind of push some of the pixels around, and we're going to use actually a sharpen to do that. So what we can do here is if you go into the image filters and you look for sharpen, we can place this into our network, And now we immediately get this super grainy texture. And one way to kind of combat this is to put in a blur. And usually when you're doing this kind of reaction diffusion effect, you kind of go between using your certain amount of blur and a certain amount of your sharpen in order to get this type of pattern. I feel like it looks kind of like a coral pattern actually. So if I start to increase this, notice that we get these kind of banding coral-like patterns. And what I want to do is kind of like set this up so that it's just strong enough that we start to get some nice like highlights, but I don't want it to like have that full kind of full sharpened effect. So from here, the other thing we want to do actually is we want to displace our pixels by themselves in this feedback network. But we want to do it by a really, really small amount. So by 0.01, 0.01. And let's kind of put in a button to reset our feedback network. So if I add in a keyboard in, and I put in a reference to the pulse, we can kind of reset everything. But so far, I think this gives us some really nice things to play around with. And I think that we're at a point now where we can kind of take these and then start to pass some parameters into the upper component. So what we can do here is let's go ahead and zoom out. I'm going to rename this as our like displace over feedback. And from here, what I generally like to do is I'm going to go ahead and right click on this path right here, displace over feedback, and I'm going to hit customize component. We're going to make a settings page, and then let's go ahead and just take some of the core parameters over here. So for example, like our blur, let's go ahead and take this pre-shrink and let's bind that as master. Let's take our filter size, bind that as master. Our displace weight, let's go ahead and bind that as master. Our sharpen, we can put in our sharpen amount, we can put in our dry wet, and then let's put in this opacity from our level. I think those are kind of some of the core things. Other than that, let's go ahead and take the feedback over here and let's take this reset pulse and then drag that in, bind that as master as well. And so maybe let's take our keyboard in and move that out of our network and then place that on our upper part of our network in the settings so that when we hit 1, it triggers it from the outside. The other thing that I like to do in general is to kind of have the ability to turn these different layers on and off. So this kind of makes our network a little bit more tricky to follow, but basically the idea here is that we put in a switch. We put in a switch top. And what you do is we put in our original input, and then we put in whatever our effect is. This is going to be our blur switch. And then that goes into the input of our next component. So basically, this blur switch, if this is at 1, it means that our blur is enabled. And if it's at 0, our blur is disabled. So what I like to do is take this switch, and I'm going to drag and drop this right over underneath our blur. I'm actually going to drag it up a little bit. And here under this label, we're going to call this blur enabled. So now what we can do is, depending if I go to our parameters, actually notice how it's a slider right now. That's not really helpful to us. I kind of like having it as a toggle. So what I'll do here is I'll go to the style over here while I'm selected. See, it's called index right now, but our labels blur enabled. We're going to go to this style section, and I'm going to change it from a float to a toggle. And now it's on and off, which is great. So we're going to do the same thing with our next set of operators. So I'm going to do that with our sharpen as well. So let's put down another switch. I'm going to pass in the output from our displace, and then I'm going to connect our sharpen, and then I'm going to connect this to our level, and we're going to name this our sharpen switch. We're going to drag this over to where we had our sharpening effects, bind, and we're going to call this sharpen enabled, and we're going to make sure that this is a toggle. And let's make sure to do that with our displace as well. So let's go ahead and put down another switch. We're going to take the output from our blur switch, and we're going to connect it here. And then we're going to also connect the output from our displace. And that is going to go actually into the input of both of these. We want to make sure it's connected to the both segments of the sharpen. Maybe a little bit hard to see with our background turned on, so I'm going to turn that off so you can see a little bit better. And we're going to call this our blur, or our displace switch. And then now we're going to drag this index over to our displace section, bind, and we're going to call this displace enabled. Turn it into a toggle. And now let's make sure we've got them organized correct. So blur has all these, displace has got the displace weight, perfect. Sharpen, let's go ahead and take this index 2 and move this above so that that's our sharpen amount. Notice that the amount actually has a section enabled, so we can turn that off. And then we've got our opacity. One thing that I do like to do as well is to kind of like separate these into different chunks. And so this displace enabled, if we go over to index 3 and turn a section on, now we have kind of our blur section. Similarly, I'll do that with our sharpen. I'll go to our next index, turn a little section on for that, so we have a divider. And then maybe after our opacity, we'll do that as well. So our opacity will turn on a section. And this gives us a lot of dynamic control. I think one other small tweak that I would maybe add into this to make it like a really nice little reusable component as well is to also add in transform and then just kind of attach some of the transform controls as well. So I'm going to insert a switch, and then I'm going to insert a transform. And then we're going to hook up our transform to our switch. And then let's go ahead and maybe above our opacity, let's put in our translate, our rotate, and maybe just our scale. And then we're going to take this switch right here. This is going to be called transform switch. And we're going to take this index and we're going to place that above T. And we're going to rename this as transform enabled and turn this into a section or a toggle. All right, so now we can, for example, enable transform. And if you want to scale things up by a small amount, notice that we'll get some cool kind of displacement effects here. Displace is not enabled right now, so we can enable that. And then we can play around with, maybe let's bring down some of our sharpening so we can see more of this effect a little bit. And turn on our sharpening. Oh yeah. But you can get some really fun effects out of this. Let's put our scale back down at 0. And I think that turning things into like a reusable component like this gives you a lot of really fun things to play around with. So now we have these like high level controls that we can use where we've kind of pulled out some of the core mechanics. And for the effect that we were playing around with, we don't actually need this transform enabled. What we really want here is maybe like a higher pre-shrink at around 4 to get the effect that I had going earlier on. And then keep that displace enabled on. And then let's also put in a little bit more of our sharpening. But I think that really captures kind of the overall effect. One other thing that I've found helpful in the past too is in this displace here, maybe instead of just displacing it by itself, you could actually pass in another top. So one thing that can look really cool here is to place in like a noise, for example, and then use this noise. If I set the parent panel size, and then if I use this as the displacement, notice that suddenly you get these really cool kind of effects. So what we could do here is, I'm going to undo that. What we can do is maybe let's place an in, and let's have this set up by default. So if you use the lower pin of the input, that's going to be the default source if nothing is connected. So we're going to hook that up. So if you decide not to put anything on this input, it's just going to use whatever you decide to pass in by default. And what you can do externally is now we could potentially like make a noise, or you could pass some other texture in. I'm going to set it as parent panel size, use 32-bit float, turn off monochrome, and then I'm going to pass this in as the input, and you can get some really, really fun effects. This kind of like marbling effect is something I learned from Nodo. So then you can kind of animate this, and you can also change the harmonics as well. So you can get some really nice features out of this. And what I would do is I highly, highly recommend that you take this component now and then go ahead and go over and drag and drop this into your custom container section so that you can reuse it for later. I guess actually one other thing we could do with this is maybe let's just take the same type of audio reactivity that we had from this earlier noise, and let's map that into the transform here. So instead of noise, we'll just use the same audio reactivity. That looks pretty cool. Let's do that instead. That's fun. And now what we want to do is basically add in our motion tracking. So I'm going to use the distance between my hands to basically control a low pass filter on the audio. So I'll start playing the audio in a second so that you can hear it, but we're going to apply a filter using that. And then we're also going to use that to control how much of an effect that we're getting from our noise. So I think one thing that I did here is I basically like scaled the period of our noise based off the distance of our hands. So that part's actually really quick to set up. I'm going to make an input because right now we don't have any inputs to this project. So I'll make a chop in, and then I'm going to zoom out. And basically, if you're working inside the body tracking plugin, which I have a link to in my Patreon, basically what you'll want is this hand data chop right here. And you can pass this in, and notice that when I have my hands together and in the frame, we get a value for the hand distance. So this P1 hand distance right here, we're actually going to just snag that specific channel and we can remap it. I'm going to turn off the background so it's a little easier to see. So we're going to select out from our input. I'm going to actually move this down for a second just so we have a little bit more space to work with. And we're going to select out just the channel P1 hand distance. You can also just go over to this little arrow here and select it. Oop. There we go. Okay, so notice that this value is going to go from 0 to 1. The next thing we want to do is basically map this hand distance into a value that's going to be useful for our visuals. So one thing that I ended up doing here is instead of mapping it from like 20 to, instead of having our period go to 20, I thought it looked interesting to have it go from like 5 to 20. And what we can do is connect this select to a math. And we're going to change the range of it. Instead of it going from 0 to 1, we want it to go from around 5 to 20. And let's go ahead and place a null down. And then what we'll do here is we're going to pass a reference from here to our noise 2 under the period. So now when we change the distance between our hands, actually I'm going to reverse it because I feel like it ends up getting grainier when the period is low. So I'm gonna flip it. I actually want it to go from 20 to 5. So now it's kind of like more of a smooth texture, and then when you spread your hands apart, it'll get a bit grainier. Cool. Okay. And the last piece here, second to last piece here, we're gonna make an audio filter. So basically, I'm gonna play the sound right now. And what we can do here is you can place in a audio filter. And when it's on low pass, let's listen to this. Notice that when I have this value at around like 2.5, you can still kind of hear it, but it sounds kind of like all the audio is being played through a door. We basically have like rolled off all of the highs. So it's a low pass. And then as we increase it, we bring back all of the original audio. So we can hook this up. So instead of it going from, maybe I kind of liked having a little bit of the background sound in there by default. So we want it to go from a value from around 2.5 to 4.5. So we'll make another math, and it's going to go from 2.5 to 4.5. And then we'll make a null, and we're going to pass that into our audio filter. So I'll put this in an active mode, drag it over to our audio filter, and pass it as a reference. Now that that's working, I'm going to go ahead and bypass it so you can still hear me. And I think the last thing that I did here is that I kind of tweaked the amount that the RGB delay was being used here. So I liked having a little bit of it, so maybe having it go from like 0.27 to 1, depending on the distance of our hands. But you know what? Why don't we just actually just map the value directly? I'm just going to place a null down, and we're just going to set the dry wet mix of the RGB delay to the distance between our hands. Cool, and I think that's it. So here, hopefully this gives you a lot of different things to play around with. I think that like go wild with this feedback technique. I think there's a lot to explore there. This audio reactivity component, I think is really, really fun to hook up to a lot of different things. If you feel like it's not snappy enough, one thing that you can do is take this lag and lower it. You could turn it off entirely. But then if you have a song that you want like a lot of like slower motion as well, you can kind of ramp the lag back up so you can get some nice easing applied. The way that we ended up mapping in the motion tracking, I feel like changed a couple different parameters, but there's a lot of different things that you can do here. You could also map in the velocity of your hands to control different parameters, but this was just kind of a test set of visuals that I had fun making, and I hope you learned something from it. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. I'm going to have the project files in my Patreon, and I'll put a link to that as well, where I also have a link to the motion control component. Yeah, if you want to support me, consider giving the video a like and subscribe. In the next tutorial, I'm actually going to do a breakdown of the particle system that I showed in the body tracking component. And as a little sneak peek, this thing's really exciting. So you can see here, what I'm doing is I'm just basically drawing the circle tops for my hand position, but this also works with any top. So if I put down a noise, for example, and I pipe that in, the particle system is going to be generated based off of this component. And you can also control what the motion is controlled by and the color. So if I start to animate this, it'll also start to animate all the particles. And for example, if I turn off the monochrome, we can get all the color back. So I'm really, really excited to show you all how to use this. I've done this for a number of different projects, and I think it'll be super, super useful. So keep an eye out for that tutorial. Thanks again. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.